This is video 2. We are now at the bottom of page 198, finishing up lesson 5-2. And I want us to read what's at the bottom of this page, and I'll move my phone as we go. You can use any common denominator or the least common denominator to add and subtract, unlike fractions. The least common denominator, LCD, which I introduced you to in the last video, is the least common multiple of the denominators. All right, so what I was telling you in the last video is that, let's go back to our example. Here we found the least common denominator by finding the least common multiple. But a week ago, or more by the time you watch this video, when we wanted to find common bottoms for fractions, we simply multiplied them together. So I want us to look at that again and how that worked, okay? So we simply said 3 times 15, and that gave us a 15 under this fraction and a 15 under this fraction. And that is the same in this case as our least common denominator. But that's not always going to be true. So let's look at some more examples to see the difference. Let's look at the top of page 199, example 2, adding and subtracting unlike fractions. Add or subtract and write each answer in simplest form. That means you must reduce it all the way. From here on out, answers are not going to be completely correct unless your fractions have been reduced to their simplest form. All right, let's look at the fraction 9/10 and subtract the fraction 7/8. So we have 9/10 minus 7/8. Now we have two options. We can look for the least common denominator, which I know would be 40, because if I found all the multiples of 8, that would be 8, 16, 24, 32, 40, and then the multiples of 10, 10, 20, 30, 40, and 40 is the first thing we come to in common. I could have done that on paper, but I was able to do it more quickly in my head. So we could have done, we're going to work this right here, 40 as our common denominator, using our least common multiple, our least common denominator, and we would have said, how did we get from 10 to 40? Because this fraction is equivalent to this fraction. So 10 times 4 is how we got to 40, so now we've got to say 9 times 4, which is 36. And then the second fraction, how did we get from 8 to 40? We multiplied it by 5, so 7 times 5 is 35, because whatever we do to the bottom, we must do to the top, and vice versa. And this is easy. Remember, whether we're adding or subtracting, we do not change our common denominator. We keep it, but then we do the math of the numerator, and 36 minus 35 is 1. Now let's look at how the book did it. Instead of finding the least common denominator, they did what we did last week and just kept it a little more simple. They didn't have to go through the process to find the least common denominator or the least common multiple. They just multiplied them together. And they said if they're multiplied together, the common denominator is 80. And how did we get from 10 to 80? Multiplied by 8, 9 times 8 is 72. How did we get from 8 to 80? 8 times 10 is 80. So we say 7 times 10 is 70, because whatever we do to the bottom, we must do to the top. Now we have 72 minus 70, which is 2 over 80. Now what I want you to see is that we're on our way to the exact same answer. The only difference is that mine is in simplest form and this one is not. We notice that both of these numbers are even, so therefore they're both divisible by 2, and therefore we're going to simplify to 1/40th, because 2 divided by 2 is 1, 80 divided by 2 is 40. Now we're in simplest form because that 1 can't go any lower. All right, it looks like based on these examples that your homework is probably going to tell you when they want you to use the least common denominator, and this is an example of that. So we're going to need to find the least common denominator between 10 and 8. So that's what we did up here, and I simply would have done that by writing the multiples of 10. I would have written 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. And then I would have written the multiples of 8, 8, 16, 24, 32, 40. I did that for you verbally in the top example. And we found that 40 was the least common denominator. And then we rewrote it by making equivalent fractions, which is exactly what they're doing here. And that's how we got our answer. Okay, so I just jumped ahead on that one. All right, let's do one more. This one says use mental math. That's interesting. This one you could do in your head, but it's okay if you need to do it on paper, and you'll get better at the mental math as you go. So what I want you to notice here, and this is something you should always check with fractions, could my least common denominator be one of the denominators that I'm already given? Could 12 be the least common denominator? 6 couldn't, of course, because 12 can't go into 6. But 12 can. It's the lowest thing that itself can go into. And 6 can also go into it. So it is actually the least common denominator. So now let's do equivalent fractions so that we can add these. So we're going to make both denominators be 12. This one's going to stay the same because 5 is already over 12, so it doesn't change. We didn't multiply 12 by anything except for 1, therefore the 5 would only be multiplied by 1, but all of that's unnecessary because we can see that it was already over 12, we keep it the same. But this one must change. How did we get from 6 to 12? We multiplied by 2. Whatever we did to the bottom, we must do to the top, so we say 1 times 2 is 2. Now we have 5 twelfths plus 2 twelfths, and that's 7 twelfths. It cannot be reduced. 2 can't go into both of them, 3 can't go into both of them, nothing can go into both of them other than 1. All right, let's look at our last example. This is another example where we already have a fraction with our least common denominator in it. Look at it. Could the least common denominator be 3? No, 9 could never go into 3 like that. Actually, it could probably as a decimal number, but could 9 be the least common denominator? Yes, it's the smallest thing that itself can go into, and 3 can go into it as well. So it is the least common denominator, and let's change these to equivalent fractions. Let's jump down to this row. The 9 doesn't need to change because it's already in its correct form with the least common denominator, so we're going to leave the 2 numerator as it is. But this one needs to change. We changed from 1/3 to something over 9. How did we get from the 3 to the 9? We multiplied by 3. Whatever we do to the bottom up here, we must do to the top. If we multiply the bottom by 3, we multiply the top by 3. 1 times 3 is 3. So we have 3 ninths minus 2 ninths, and that answer is 1 ninth, which is completely simplified. All right, that's the end of that video. Hope that's helpful. Bye-bye.